OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, July 16th. A surge in enforcement by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has led to 2 fatal shootings by ICE agents in recent weeks. Those occurred in Texas and Maine, but Oregon continues to grapple with immigration enforcement as well. The Portland ICE building that was a focal point of protests much of last year is back in the news as lawsuits and land use cases surrounding the property come to a head. Today, we're going to spend some time getting you up to speed on this lingering fight here in South Portland, just up the road from OPB headquarters. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
I'm Portland City Government reporter Alex Zielinski.
And I'm OPB Legal Affairs reporter Conrad Wilson.
So it has been a while in my memory since we talked immigration on the podcast, and that is partly blessedly because that very intense series of actions that Oregon saw last year has dissipated. There is no longer this huge public surge in stops and detentions in Oregon. There are no longer the massive nightly protests outside the ICE building. Conrad, let's start with you. How would you characterize where things stand right now?
So, a couple of things. There are still protests, albeit much smaller than what we saw earlier this year and last year. And immigration enforcement has also continued. It just looks different. It's not as in-your-face enforcement that we saw during Operation Black Rose. That was that kind of ICE operation in Portland and Southwest Washington that ran from September to March, and it led to about a little more than 1,000 immigration arrests. People with immigration cases, they're still being called to the Portland ICE building for these check-ins, right? And they have to show up. And actually, that was the case this week when Francisco Aguirre, an asylum seeker from El Salvador who's lived in Portland for a long time, he went to his appointment and he came out and this is what he said.
I feel happy. My tears are tears of happiness because I'm back to stay with my daughters, with my family. But it's so stressful, sad, knowing that so many are detained in jail. And I hope I had the power, to free them all. I hope nobody have to go through that process and be free.
And so really the thing is, Aguirre came out, but not everybody does. And for some people, that's the beginning of, being arrested and entering the deportation system and kind of, exiting the United States.
Yeah. You mentioned Operation Black Rose there. I will just put a plug very high up for the Crackdown. That is a video documentary that you and other OPB reporters participated in detailing this huge surge in ICE enforcement in Oregon last year. Appointment watching, if you guys are out there, opb.org, please watch that. But anyway, things are a bit diminished from that very sort of high point, for lack of a better term. That is not the case everywhere. As I mentioned, the country right now is reacting to a fatal shooting by ICE in coastal Maine this week, along with another one last week in Houston. That is having repercussions. ICE briefly at least ceased car stops this week and before the president sort of told them to reverse course. So anyway, it's clearly still a focal point in national policy, becoming more relevant. Even in Portland, though, the remnants of these fights we saw last year are still playing out. Conrad, you recently wrote about actually 2 lawsuits ongoing against ICE. Just give us an overview of what those lawsuits are about.
Sure. So the lawsuits are similar. Both are challenging the way the federal government uses crowd control weapons, so tear gas, pepper balls, that kind of thing. But they make really different legal arguments. One was filed by demonstrators and independent journalists who are represented by the ACLU of Oregon. And in that case deals with First Amendment, free speech, the right to protest, kind of those fundamental constitutional issues. The other case was filed by residents of an apartment complex that's kitty corner called Reach. It's kitty corner from the ICE building in the South Waterfront neighborhood. And they also say that their rights were violated by federal law enforcement officers from all this tear gas. But they say, it entered their homes, it entered their bodies, and that was sort of a violation of their rights.
Yeah, you said that building is called Gray's Landing. Am I right? It's operated by Reach CDC.
Right.
Okay. As we often see with lawsuits, there has been some push and pull here. I've followed it loosely. You've covered it a lot. I mean, I'm remembering a federal judge initially barred ICE from indiscriminately using gas and flashbangs, and then appeals court judges reversed in sort of a yo-yo. I mean, help us understand how it's worked.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, I covered this stuff, and the procedural back and forth has been really tricky to follow. Yeah. It's two similar cases moving through the courts sort of at the same time, and yeah, there's just been some unusual procedural steps. The federal judges overseeing the protesters case and the apartment complex case in Oregon, they each came to their own conclusion, on different legal grounds after hearing evidence that really, what was happening in the streets with all this tear gas, like they said that this was unlawful and it basically needed to be limited. And they agreed with the protesters and the apartment complex residents when they decided to really curb when the Department of Homeland Security could use crowd control weapons in the area directly outside the Portland ICE building. So it was a very limited injunction. The Trump administration appealed those rulings to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And those judges decided actually to pause those injunctions. So basically, what it meant from a practical standpoint is the feds could use crowd control weapons as the courts considered the broader legal arguments in the case.
Yeah, and as you noticed, the appeals court panel, I think you reported, is comprised of two members that Trump appointed and one member he didn't,
right.
which can have bearing, obviously. So that brings us to some oral arguments in both of these cases that you covered last week. Let's just get to the essential arguments in play in these. Let's start with that lawsuit brought by protesters.
Sure. So basically the protesters say that there should be limits on crowd control weapons, and they are very pleased with the ruling they got in Oregon, right? I mean, they say that the federal judge who heard all this evidence about retaliation from federal law enforcement officers towards independent journalists and protesters, his name was Michael Simon, the judge.
Yeah.
They said he got it right. And so Matt Borden, he's one of the attorneys arguing on their behalf before the Ninth Circuit last week. And here's what he argued to this three-judge panel.
There is an extensive factual record in this case where it shows repeated misuse of crowd control weapons, firing off the roofs of buildings where they have no possibility of hitting their target, firing into big clouds of tear gas where they can't see what they're shooting at, hitting people in the head, attacking church groups, elderly people, children, infants. The police officers who were there, they all testified that this response that we were getting from the federal government was disproportionate to the activities of a few isolated criminal actors.
So Borden acknowledged that there was criminal behavior, but there were more appropriate ways for federal law enforcement to deal with that. And I think this kind of sums up part of his argument, what he says right here.
The thing is, you cannot just go whole hog against the crowd unless there's actual reason to do it.
Now, attorneys with the Justice Department, which are representing the Trump administration here, their argument was more legally dense, but they kind of referenced, this exchange sort of talks about this part where influencers and kind of supporters of ICE and the administration kind of got special access. And one of the judges asked the attorney for the Justice Department sort of about that. And this exchange, I don't know, it sort of illustrates part of the challenge the government has with the case.
What we were dealing with is a difference of opinion in how law enforcement should respond when individuals are trespassing, when they are impeding traffic. But at the end of the day, this is a First Amendment retaliation case.
Where those individuals, though, I guess this is where my concern is, right? You have protesters and journalists and whatnot walking onto ICE property, right? They got on the driveway, whatever. And so ICE is saying, we want to keep you away. We're trying to protect the building, protect ourselves. But then yet you have these influencers who are on the building with the agents. So it's a very clear difference in the treatment. It's kind of like, hey, if you agree with us, you can come hang out, but if you don't, you need to be careful because we may end up, throwing projectiles at you.
I mean, I do think there is a difference in the facts and the circumstances between the protesters trespassing and the influencers Your Honor is referencing from.
Were the influencers welcomed? Is that the difference?
I think the difference is whether there is a security threat.
I'm going to guess that judge we're hearing there is not one of the Trump appointees. Am I right?
Right. She was appointed by President Biden.
Okay, so we have two arguments, though. One is there's a First Amendment guarantee that people can speak their minds to government, and the Fed saying, well, sure, you can do that, but you better stay out of our driveway. We need to protect the building, and that means we need to be able to use tear gas. That is one case. There's another case. The lawsuit brought by the residents of Gray's Landing right across the street from this facility, often getting tear gassed. You wrote in your coverage, Conrad, that the arguments that the residents of this building are making are a little more novel than the ones in the other case. What did you mean by that? Help us understand it.
Sure. So, I mean, basically, there just isn't a really strong legal precedent that they can rely on, right? I mean, think about their perspective, right? They live in this place, suddenly, night after night, tear gas and, loud flashbangs, like just a lot of activity is happening right outside their door. Mm-hmm. They can't go anywhere. There's nowhere else. I mean, it's their home, right? And suddenly tear gas is coming into their house. They're smelling pepper balls. It's loud. It's disruptive. And the argument that they were making is that, like, the government knows what it's doing here, right? And it's actually causing sort of these toxic chemicals to come into our home, and that's a violation of our rights. Like, but and they're continuing to do it knowingly, right? And so they've had a harder time making that case just because judges have sort of said, like, well, we don't know the government's intending to harm you, right? I mean, they're trying to protect their facility, right? And they're arguing that they're not intending to do this. And one of the things the judges kind of kept talking about was like the winds, right? Like these are, the direction that these chemicals are going. Sure, you're across the street, but in a legal context, we have to, like, if the wind blows the other way, what about the folks on the other side of the street, right? Yeah. And so it just was it's a harder case, I think, for the courts to sort of understand. Yeah. And, it's akin to sort of like lead in drinking water is another example that kind of came up, where it's like the government knows there's lead in drinking water, and it's not doing anything to remedy the problem. Can the government be held responsible for sort of showing deliberate indifference towards people? Right. And that was the core of the Gray's Landing case, just that there was deliberate indifference shown towards people that live in this apartment complex. Yeah, you report it's a civil liberties argument they're making, and just not something maybe that U.S. Jurisprudence has considered that much. So we've noted a couple times this is a 3-judge appeals court panel. 2 of them are Trump appointees. Heard a little bit of contentious questioning there by the Biden appointee on the panel. What did you take from these oral arguments? Did they offer any indication about how they're thinking about it, which way they might come down in these cases? It's really hard to predict. I think both the government, the protesters, and the apartment complex residents, all those attorneys were asked really difficult questions. Yeah. At times things got pretty legally dense. At the same time, to add to the confusion of this whole thing, there's already been oral arguments before this same panel during an earlier procedural part of this case, right? And so in some ways, like, this almost felt like not quite a sequel, but like halfway there. And so they've already decided that this panel, 2 of these judges on this panel have already decided that they're legally uncomfortable with the positions that the federal judges in Oregon took, limiting tear gas, right, and crowd control weapons. So I don't know how they're going to rule. I would never guess, but,
that does seem to suggest something. We know that at least in one case, maybe in less of a sweeping ruling, they've been sort of uncomfortable with those protections. We are talking here about tear gas use, flashbang use in one facility, one corner of one city. It seems possible. I don't know. I mean, that whatever outcome this case has, it's a Ninth Circuit appeals case. It could have implications more broadly. I mean, will this potentially reshape when and how law enforcement can use these kinds of munitions in general? What do we know about how sweeping, how far-reaching a decision might be?
It's really hard to know how sweeping it could be. There have been large protests in other parts of the country, right, that are looking at some of these same issues. Chicago, Los Angeles, they saw really big protests, and there's litigation surrounding the actions that law enforcement took in those places as well. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's a general agreement in some sense that you can't. Some law enforcement acted very heavy-handed towards protesters who were engaged in completely constitutionally protected speech, right? That did happen. On the other hand, law enforcement is trying to effectuate its laws. It's trying to carry out, federal laws. And so that tension, I think, is something that, the courts have really seemed to struggle with trying to understand where that line is.
Yeah.
How far is too far?
This might not be the end-all, be-all. We just sort of have, of any sort of, policy nationwide or in the Ninth Circuit, we'll just sort of have to see how things pan out, in other words. So that is the latest in what's going on in federal court on at least these cases. That is not the only ongoing case, though, surrounding the ICE building. What do I mean? You'll have to wait till we come back from this quick break. And we're back. Alex, you are with us as well. I don't want to forget you. You have been also covering a fight around the ICE building. This one is a very technical fight, even more technical maybe than what we were just talking about with Conrad. It has to do with land use law. What's it all about?
Yeah, it's a very Portland situation in that Portlanders love to use land use and zoning policies to fight for values. Think about the battle with the oil containers on the Willamette River and the Lloyd Center Mall, Mm-hmm. Anyway, so last year, a member of the public filed a complaint against the owners of the ICE building that Conrad was just talking about. But in this situation, we're looking inside the building, not the activity outside. A little background on the building. It's leased out to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, leased out to ICE, by an ownership group led by a local real estate investor named Stuart Lindquist. It's largely an administrative building, but occasionally holds people who are in the process of being deported and en route to a detention center or somewhere else. And it operates under this really unique land use agreement with the city. Unique in that it's rare to have a privately owned building used to detain people by a public entity. So the city laid out some rules in this 2011 agreement when ICE began leasing from the owners. And that included limits to how long people could be detained in the building, no more than 12 hours and not overnight. So that, along with a number of other things, but that's kind of the important piece of this agreement. So the complaint filed that I mentioned last year accused the property owner of violating this rule specifically. After some public records came out and revealed that the in and out times for people being held in the building exceeded 12 hours a number of times and were overnight. And it also accused the owners for violating a city rule around requesting permission to place plywood over the windows, which happened after protests started outside the ICE facility. And the city's permitting department reviewed these complaints and agreed. So they issued a violation against the property owners, which comes with a hefty penalty, fines of more than $900 a month if things aren't addressed. And so that's kind of where this all began.
If I'm right, the building, it was a former bank facility,
it was a bank, right? So it was not zoned to be a detention center.
Yeah, right. So there's this finding, the owner or the ownership group of the ICE building appeals the decision.
Right.
What do they say? What is their response?
Yeah, so they essentially quickly asked the city to reconsider, but didn't really offer up much to change the city's minds. It was kind of splitting hairs. One of the arguments was that, yes, maybe people were detained overnight or longer than 12 hours, but not in the specific detention space that the land use agreement is explicit about. It was a different part of the building. A lot of little nitpicky kind of, arguments in response. Anyway, this appeal elevated the decision to the city's hearings office, which is an impartial office that determines land use appeals, kind of like a judge within the city. And there was a 2-day hearing in May where the hearings officer heard arguments from the attorneys for the building owner and from permitting staff and city lawyers. They kind of went head to head on this violation. This is where it starts getting complicated, which is funny because I feel like it already is. But hold on.
Okay.
Shortly after that hearing, attorneys for the property owner filed another kind of legal complaint against the city's hearings officer, saying that he and kind of the city was acting with bias against the property owner because of who he leases to. And that was reflected in the fact that the city kind of sped up the timeline for the appeal hearing. That was the explanation of the lawyers. They wanted a judge to review it.
Yep.
And initially, they asked the courts just to keep the city from releasing its ruling on this appeal. And the court said, sure, we'll tell the city to hold off. The city challenged this last week, and a judge allowed them to release the ruling on that appeal on Friday, which leads us to the ruling, which found that, yep, the city was right to issue a violation against the building owner. So it upheld the city permitting office's decision.
So this ruling has existed for some time.
Sure.
It's just that a court said, okay, you can release this ruling and make it public.
Make it public, yeah.
And therefore, we find out about it and you
Right.
report on it.
Now what?
So now, you're right, the building has been found in violation. Is the city going to start issuing fines? Like, what happens now?
Yeah. No, the city cannot start issuing fines yet. Of course, that makes total sense because the judge last week only allowed the ruling on that land use appeal to be made public, but didn't allow it to be enforced. That can only happen after this case is resolved in court, since it's still open. Basically, a judge just lifted the ban on publishing the land use ruling. But there's going to be another bigger hearing in August where the property owners and their legal team will argue that their client, had his constitutional rights violated because of the city rule, issuing this land use ruling and kind of fast tracking this whole appeals process because allegedly he is a landlord for ICE and the city doesn't like ICE.
Right.
If the judge agrees with the property owners, this complaint will have to go back to square one in the city with a new hearings officer reviewing it, a whole new process all over again. If the judge disagrees, sides with the city, I believe this ruling can be upheld and the property owners can start being fined about $980 each month, an amount that doubles after 2 months if nothing changes.
Wow.
Which, is on the property owner to prove, hey, we aren't holding people here longer. We have the plywood off the windows. I think you mentioned, I think there is plywood off the windows now.
No. So I was biking past today because as I was coming into work and I turned around because I forgot to look. No, still encased in plywood.
Okay.
The whole, if they removed any, I couldn't notice because
Yeah.
it is still a plywood shell out there.
Yeah. So that's still obviously an issue. But all of this is quite a big tangle. Meanwhile, ICE is still operating out of this building down the street.
Yeah.
They're still, I assume, paying rent to this landlord. Whether or not the city will be able to intervene in this very wonky way is still a big question mark.
So stay tuned on basically on both of the things we talked about today. I will just say this, this is all very messy, technical, obviously worthwhile checking in on. I'll just say from a personal perspective, it is preferable, this nuanced jargon-filled stuff to the very tense unrest we saw last year, even though those things gave us, these icons like the Portland frog and some really light moments. I would rather be encased in a morass of process than some of the worrying stuff we saw last year. Thanks, both of you, for coming on. This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien and Michelle Wiley, and our audio engineer is Naleen Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network, and special shout out this week to OPB's Brooke Herbert, who helped put together material for the episode. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.